So I will be talking today about the design of Biff. So Biff is a web framework that I've developed. So this is the website here, biffweb.com. So Biff is a web framework that I developed while I was a full-time entrepreneur. So I spent 4 years doing that full-time, and then just in the past year, I've been just working at a regular startup as a software engineer, and then continuing to work on Biff sort of on weekends. So Biff is designed for myself foremost of all, and so that's why it's kind of targeted more towards solo developers. You don't have to be a solo developer to use it, but in a lot of the design decisions that I've made, that's the demographic that I've been optimizing for. So this talk will have two sections, basically. So in the first half, I'm going to just give sort of a standard overview of, you know, what is Biff, answering the what, right? But what I'd really like to get to is more the second half, and where we'll pick just kind of a few of the points from Biff and dig more into the design details and talk about, you know, the thought process and motivation behind, you know, why is Biff this way? So as far as what is in Biff, as I was brainstorming about, you know, okay, what are the parts of Biff that make it unique, or the things that I think it brings to the table, I think that it can mostly be bucketed into these three categories. So there's tooling, architecture, and documentation. And so I'll just give kind of a brief overview of all this stuff. So in the tooling section, well, we can just start from the beginning for, you know, how do you create a new project? And so if we pop back over here to the Biff website, you can hit getting started and go to the next page here. And so there's a little command here you can use to create a new Biff project. Excuse me. The only prerequisites, you got to have Clojure installed. But once you have that, I'll copy this and go over into here. And so in the Biff repository, I have basically, there's a starter project in one of the directories there. So what this script is doing is it's basically just cloning that directory from the project, and then it'll do a few tweaks based on the input you give. So let's see. So it's asking me for what folder to put the project in. So I'll just say example, and I'll just stick with kind of the default of con.example for the main namespace. So now we're in here, and we've got some stuff in our directory. So Biff is kind of divided into two parts, right? So one part is all this stuff you see here, like when you make a new project, there's going to be a number of files that are dropped into your project. But Biff also includes, so if we go into deps.edn, the first dependency here is this com.biffweb/biff library. So Biff includes also a library that has a number of helper functions and glue code and things. And so some of the code for Biff is stuff that's copied into your local project, but then a lot of it is also stored in a separate library that you can use. So that is the new project flow. The next bit here is tasks. So Biff includes a number of commands that you can run. And so they're all prefixed with this cloj-m dev thing. And so I'll hit this help thing, and this will show us a list of the commands that we can run. Since this is the first time we're running it, it takes a little bit of time to cache, but usually it's pretty fast. So these are the commands, and there's a number of things, like there's dev, which is the most common one to start up the app. There's like an Uber jar, you can make that and make an Uber jar, and there's commands for deploying and various other things. But anyway, so when you make the project, it says, okay, you can run this command to start up the app. And so you can just do that. So this command will do a few things. The very first thing it's going to do is it will check to see, do you have this config.env file? Because so Biff's config is, some of it is stored in in a Clojure EDN file, which is checked into your repository, but then a little bit of it is just stored in environment variables, which are not checked into source. So this will, if you don't have it, it'll just generate that file based on a template. It will also start a Tailwind watcher in the background. So that's what this is from. So it'll compile your CSS, and then the rest of this is just starting up the app. And there are a number of these lines where it says starting something or other, and we'll get into what these are in a minute. But now so it says system started, and it gives us a URL that we can go to. So we can just open this here. I'll zoom in so you can see that. So the project, when you create it, it'll start out as a very basic CRUD application, just to kind of demonstrate the the basic features of Biff, like how do you add things to your database schema, how do you make a HTTP endpoint and things like that. So that's tasks. The REPL. So the next tooling thing that Biff kind of does for you is it has, and I call it eval on save feature. So whenever you save a file in Biff, Biff will, so it does the file watcher. So when you save the file, it will evaluate any files that have changed, and then also like any files that depend on those. So I can just demonstrate it pretty briefly. Okay, so here we got our project, and I'll just demonstrate it on this kind of landing page here. So there is a settings.cloj file here that happens to have a little var here where it says my application. And so that's where this bit of text is coming from. So we can change this to like, hello there, and I'll hit save. And in fact, it's already updated over here. So what that's doing over here is, so first of all, okay, so the Tailwind watcher is also doing its own file watcher. So your CSS gets updated. And then here is the file watcher from Biff, where it says, okay, the settings namespace changed, let's evaluate that. And then let's also evaluate all these other namespaces. And then Biff after this is all done, Biff sends a command to this web page that says, okay, refresh the page. So ultimately what you end up with is kind of a similar workflow to, if you're just doing like any React project or with ClojureScript or whatever, where you hit save and your stuff compiles and your web page updates and voila, right? So the main difference here is that Biff is implementing this workflow for the back end as well. So it's not just the front end. You hit save and everything's up to date for the most part. So that's okay. So that's the REPL, and the last bit here is deployment. So again, I mentioned that Biff includes a number of tasks. Let me just bring those up again. So one of these is this deploy command, and the way this works is that Biff has kind of a recommended approach for deploying, which is that you just take a plain Ubuntu VPS and provision it. And so if we pop over to, in the documentation here under reference, and actually there's a link to it from here if you hit this production page, there's a list of steps you can follow. And basically what these steps have you do is you make a Ubuntu VPS. I use DigitalOcean for all my stuff, but you can use something else. And then in your Biff project, there's just a little server setup bash script. And so you copy this over to your server, you run the script, and then your server is all provisioned. And so once you do this, then you can use this deploy command. And so anytime you want to deploy your changes, you just run this thing, and this will copy all of your files to the server with rsync, and then it'll restart the application. Besides that, so again, that's the recommended approach, and I think that's best, most likely for most people who are likely to be using Biff. Biff also comes with a few other options. So like I mentioned, there is an uberjar command, so that'll spit an uberjar out, and then there's also a Docker file that uses the uberjar command. So if you want to do more of a typical like container-based deployment approach, that's an option as well. So that's deployment. Let's get into the architecture. And so this is more the guts of what's going on inside of Biff when you start a Biff application. And so the first thing here is components. So let me just open the main namespace here. So this I'll leave that open. This con.example namespace is the entry point for our application. So if we go to the bottom here, we've got this main function. So your application starts, and this thing will run up, and mostly it just calls the start function. And here, and so what this is doing is we have this new system thing that we're generating, and so this is a hash map that is describing your application and all the resources that are started and things. And the way this works is you start with this initial system map, which is right up here. And so this is a map that includes references to all your application code and various things, like there's database schema in here, and there's a ring handler, and a few other things. And so the way this works is we take this initial system map, and then we pass it into this reduce call here. Excuse me. And so what this is doing is we're iterating through this components thing. And so each one of these is a function, and we are calling the function and passing this initial system map to it. And so the list of components, by the way, is right here. So effectively what we're doing is we're taking this initial system and we're threading it through each one of these functions. And so each function will take in the map, make some changes to it, maybe start up some stateful resources, and then whatever changes it makes, it'll put it in the system map and then pass it on to the next function, right? And so that's what, like when you start up the application and you see these starting messages, those are corresponding to these components here, right? And so like the main ones are like, there's this one, it reads in your configuration, and then there's another one for starting up the database, which is XTDB by default. And then there's like, here's one for starting up the Jetty web server. So that's components. And the other big part is modules. So these are both kind of vague architecture sounding terms, right? But modules is what I call the thing where we keep our application code. So one thing, actually, let's go back to components. You'll notice each one of these components is prefixed with the Biff namespace. And so that is coming from up here, from that com.biff web library I mentioned at the beginning. So because all these components, like I generally refer to this as your framework code. And so these are things that are hopefully fairly general and are used in multiple projects. And in fact, everything in Biff is kind of a wrapper around all of this stuff. This is the core of what Biff is providing for your application, right? And so modules is then the abstraction Biff uses for, okay, where do you put all your application code, the stuff that's specific to what you're trying to build, right? And so this is a list of different modules, and most of these are defined in our application namespaces. So if we, let's see, I'll just open another tab here, and so say there's this home.cloj file, and so this file corresponds to the landing page right here. And so like at the bottom we have this module, which is a map, and there are 5 or 6 different keys that a module can have, but the most common one is routes. So routes has a list of write-it routes, and so like here's one for the home page, and so I can go up here and say, you know, home page, here's the bit where it says, where is the bit where yeah, okay, so sign up for app name, and so that's where this is coming from. So anyway, so that is the basic architecture structure of Biff, is these components and modules. And if you want to be a Biff expert, just read the source code for all these components, and then boom, you know everything there is to know. So another significant architectural feature of Biff is that it does not use React or Clojure scripts or anything. It's primarily a backend framework. And so by default, Biff comes with HTMX, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the second part of the presentation. But basically Biff is set up in a way so that for most apps you can just get by with HTMX and stuff. And let me actually demonstrate this. So if we sign up here, so normally Biff will send an email with a login link for authentication, but since we haven't added any configuration for sending email, it will just print out a link to the console here. So I will copy and paste this into the browser. Boom, we're logged in. So this is the kind of example CRUD app that Biff includes. And so it's got a couple forms, and so I can type something in here and hit update, and boom, here it is. So this is a regular form that we're just doing a post to. And this next form demonstrates doing the exact same thing, but with HTMX. So same thing, but with HTMX. And wow, the power of HTMX. You know. So that's fun. There's also a example here for doing something slightly more fancy with HTMX, which is WebSockets. So if you type in something here, you can send a message. And in fact, I think I can demonstrate it pretty quickly if I just open 2 tabs. And so I'm logged in as the same user here, but on different web pages. And so say I can type a little message here and hit send, and boom, it shows up on the other one right away too. So anyway, so Biff has some examples for, how can you do slightly more interactive things with HTMX. And the last bit is disassembly. So Biff comes with a number of things out of the box. But one of the overall design principles of Biff is that I don't want anyone to be stuck with what Biff comes with, right? So everything is designed to be swapped out. And in general, the way that works is with these components and modules, again, they're just plain functions, and some of them, like all the components by default, are provided from the Biff library, and even one of the modules is actually from the Biff library also, and this is what provides the backend routes for that email link authentication. And so if there are a number of ways to change things. First of all, you can, like with components, you can add your own components. Like in one app I write, it needs to be able to receive emails instead of just sending them. And so I have a component that starts up an SMTP server. You can also remove things or change, like if you want to use Postgres instead of XDDB, you can take this component out and make a component for Postgres. And on top of that, you can also, if there's a component that you want to change its behavior, in some cases, like all of these components take some configuration options, and so you can tweak some things. But if you want to make more substantial changes, it's perfectly fine and recommended to just copy and paste the source code for any of these components into your project, and at that point you can just make any changes that you need, right? And so you can change this however you want. Nothing is baked in. And same thing for modules. If you want to do authentication differently, you can copy and paste this and change it, or just totally rip it out and do something else, use Auth0 or whatever you want to do. And disassembly also leads in fairly nicely to the last section, which is documentation, in particular the how-to section. So Biff has, there are a few things that are kind of front and center, like there's the tutorial and the reference, right, which is probably where most people will spend most of their time. But there's also a content library, which has some stuff. And so like there are some how-to guides here, for example, and in particular, these two demonstrate how do you do that disassembly, right? So like I mentioned, if you did want to actually, swap out the database, which is probably the most significant thing you can do, there's a how-to guide here that will take you through step by step. It's slightly out of date right now, actually, but I'm in the process of updating it, as well as this one. And then reframe, this is the other kind of big thing that you may or may not want to change. If you decide, maybe HTMX isn't a good fit for your app, like this will take you step by step. How do you stop using HTMX, use reframe instead? And then I've also got a handful of essays that dig into some of the background. So like, before you decide, oh, I want to swap out HTMX or XCDB, I've got some essays you can read and say, okay, these dive into, why do I use these things for Biff, and why do I think they're good, and when might you want to use something else, right? And all of these 4 sections of documentation, these come from sort of a documentation framework called the Grand Unified Theory of Documentation. And so this is pretty interesting. There's a website here which goes into and describes these different sections in detail. But basically it says like there are kind of 4 different quadrants of types of documentation that any project should have: these tutorials and how-tos and explanation, reference, and so Biff's documentation is very explicitly modeled after this framework. I just call them essays instead of explanation. So with that, you've got an overview, so hopefully we're all on the same page, and we know, okay, this is kind of what Biff is and what it looks like a little bit. And now let's dive back into some of those individual points that we went over before and talk more about the why behind it. So like, why is Biff designed this way, and what was going through my head as I was thinking about, how should we do things? So again, components are kind of the central part of Biff. And so the first question that might come up is, why do this custom component system when we've already got several libraries in the Clojure ecosystem that do this kind of thing and have plenty of traction? And so first I'll talk about Mount. So Mount is a great library. I think both of these are great libraries, and I used Mount for all of my applications before I developed Biff. And in fact, I use it now at work, and it's fine, it gets the job done. But as I was developing Biff, the main reason I didn't stick with Mount is because with Biff, again, I'm trying to make this framework where as much stuff as possible, whenever it makes sense, can be pulled out into this separate library, right? And so the issue I ran into with Mount is that Mount has you create these vars in your application namespaces to store your stateful resources. And so for Biff, that was kind of a problem, because again, I want to create these components that interact with all of your stateful resources, but I want to pull these out into a separate library. And so if I was using Mount, it would be kind of this weird situation where your application code maybe could be referencing these vars that are in your application namespaces, but then for these components, I'd have to write them in a different style and take in those resources as just like parameters to these functions. And so anyway, so I wanted a setup where it was the same. Like the way you write a library component is no different than the way you would write it if it's in your application code. And so I like this a lot because these are they're just plain functions, and they take everything as parameters. And so they do not care where they're stored, right? As far as integrant, so after I'd decided, maybe Mount wasn't a perfect fit for Biff, I started looking into integrant and figuring out how to use that. I've never actually really used integrant too much in depth myself. But I was reading the documentation a lot and actually reading through the source code and trying to figure out how to do something. And while I was in the process of that, I had this sort of mini epiphany where I realized it seems like the fundamental thing we're doing is we've got this like system map thing, and we're doing a series of transformations to it. And it reminded me a lot of Ring middleware, right? Where you've got like an HTTP request, and you've got middleware where you pass it through the middleware and it does stuff to it, and even does some things on the way out. And so Biff components are kind of structured like that, in the sense also that they, if they start up a stateful resource, they will also add a stop function to the system map. So if you want to stop the system, you can then go in the reverse direction back through all the components, and they'll close down all their system resources. So kind of a similar feel to middleware, at least is what I felt. So for me, the main benefit that I think Biff's components have over integrant for this particular situation is that they get the job done. They're pretty much the simplest thing that works. And the entire implementation is about 5 lines right here. It's the reduce function. And so again, integrant does a lot more stuff. But I think this component stuff does all the essentials that we need. And particularly for Biff's target audience, I really want Biff to be a good fit for people who are still getting familiar with the Clojure ecosystem and trying to get productive. And so if you are not already familiar with integrant, then I think this is a clear advantage. You can just get started and hopefully right away you understand like, oh, this is what it's doing, this is how it works. And then, you know, maybe later on you decide, okay, I want something more fancy and maybe I'll learn how to use integrant or one of these other solutions, right? So next bit, the REPL. So I talked a little bit about eval and save already. And in particular, to emphasize a little bit more why I think that is such an important part of Biff, I think the REPL has basically like 2 kinds of benefits. So the first kind of benefit is just that the REPL gets us back up to where everyone else is in other language ecosystems. So to explain what I mean by that, like if you are, say, developing a Python application, you'll probably have it set up so if you hit save on some file, and then it'll just automatically restart your application. Or back when I was working at Scala, like at a company that used Scala, it was the same thing. You hit save, and then it just automatically compiles any files that changed and restarts your application. And the startup time was fast enough that was a good workflow. For Clojure in particular, that doesn't really work for us because startup times are longer. And so you have this issue where if you're not familiar with the REPL and you're trying to learn Clojure, you make a change and you think, okay, how do I make this work? Like, do I have to hit Control-C every time? And obviously that's not a good workflow. And then even when you do start to learn about the REPL, sometimes you run into issues where you save something and you evaluate the file, but it's still not up to date. And you're thinking like, okay, why isn't this up to date? And then you have to learn about, vars and how to make your REPL changes actually take effect, right? So Biff tries as much as possible to just take care of that for you. So that, like, again, in particular, since it's done on when you save the file, you don't even have to have a REPL plugin set up for your editor. And you don't even need to know what the REPL is. You can just start up a Biff app and start coding on your HTMX views or whatever, and you hit save and stuff will a lot of the time just work, right? There are some bits where, like, if you want to change code that happens just during startup, like you will have to actually restart that or at least refresh the application, and Biff has tooling for that. But Biff is structured in a way so that as much as possible, you can just hit save and your changes are up to date. Now the second bucket of benefits to the REPL, of course, is going above and beyond that, where you've got a editor plugin and you're evaluating things from your editor and building up these functions, from the bottom up, sort of. And so certainly that's also recommended in Biff, and Biff also has a REPL.cloj file that has some examples and comments for how to get into doing that. Anyway, so the second point here, late binding, is just kind of this is not specific to Biff at all, but this is just the general approach generally of how you make Clojure applications REPL friendly to this sort of thing. But basically what that means is, as much as possible, we want to take code out of these components and put them in these top level vars. So for example, I have a ring handler var right here. And Biff did not always used to be structured this way. Originally I had it set up so we have this var here with write-it routes. And originally the way Biff was set up is you take these routes and you would put them right in your initial system map. And then I had a component here that would compile that into a ring handler, and then another component that would apply some middleware to that handler, and then that handler would finally get passed to this useData component. And that was kind of a bad user experience, because if you wanted to change the middleware, you didn't have just the hit save and it's up-to-date workflow. Like, you would have to refresh the system. There's a function down here, refresh. So you'd have to call this thing, and hopefully you know how to do that and things. Not to mention the middleware was kind of packaged inside this component, and so it was a little bit hard to get at. But anyway, so I ended up restructuring Biff. So I pulled those things out, and so now, like, we have the routes and we have some middleware right here, have some more middleware right here. We compile it to a ring handler right here, and then we pass it through some more middleware. And so all of your middleware and handler stuff is just here in a top-level var. And so that means when you save a file, the entire ring handler is going to be regenerated, and it's all going to be up to date. And so anyway, so in general, like this kind of thing, it just required a little bit of restructuring. In particular, some of the middleware needs to have application configuration, but we don't really have the configuration until we start the system. And so that's why originally they were in the components. And so I just had to rewrite the middleware a little bit so that it would take configuration more at runtime when you're actually getting a request. But anyway, that's light binding. The next bit here is deployment. So I mentioned already that kind of the recommended way to deploy a Biff app is by just using a plain VPS. I think for most people using Biff, that's the right approach. And particularly in my own experience as a solo entrepreneur for 4 years, when I started out, I was using more fancier deployment platforms. But what I found is that they're really nice when they work, but they don't always work, right? And when they don't work, it can be really frustrating. It felt a little bit to me like almost like you have this glass box, and your application is inside of this glass box, and you deploy and you just hit this button, and then it starts doing all this stuff inside the box, and it's great. But then if something doesn't work, it's like you're like, oh no, what do I do? And I felt like I've got my face pressed up against this glass here and thinking, like, how do I fix it? And you don't always, it's not always even a glass box. Sometimes it's a black box, right? And so I ended up switching to just DigitalOcean droplets, these plain Ubuntu VPSs, just because they're a little more close to the middle, so to speak. And again, like, I think they're pretty much the simplest thing that works. And just a plain bash script to provision them, it works great. It's very easy. And if anything breaks, you just SSH into the box and you figure out what's going wrong. And so I've personally found this to be a huge productivity boost, and especially like anyone doing solo developer stuff, I highly recommend just trying to stick with that kind of deployment approach, at least as the first thing. Now, I do think these fancier deployment things are potentially a lot more valuable when you have a project or a company that's more scaling up. Like if you're far past the point where you're running your thing on a single instance. Like if you got multiple instances and web servers and workers and all these things, then certainly like having use Kubernetes or AWS or whatever you want to do. But if you're still at the early stage where you can just have your application on a single box, I think just using a VPS is the way to go. So these next 2 points are some of the most fun parts of Biff. So I've talked a lot already about this REPL eval and save workflow where you save a file, your stuff is up to date, right? So Biff has a soft deploy command, and so this is similar to the regular deploy command in that when you run this, it will use rsync to copy your files up to the server that you've provisioned. The difference is that this command will not restart your application, but instead it will tell the server to evaluate any changed namespaces, just in the exact same way as when you're developing locally and you save a file, right? And since Biff is structured in a way so that the majority of your application changes can be they can take effect with just a regular evaluation. Oftentimes, this is all you need, and that's quite handy because there's zero downtime for one thing. So if you're a solo developer and you got your application deployed on this single box, you don't even have to have downtime to deploy a lot of the changes. You just run this thing and they're up to date, and it takes like 5 seconds too. It's really fast. The final command here, and this is where we achieve true enlightenment, is what this does is it will start a local file watcher on your machine, and whenever you save a file, it will run the soft deploy command. And so it's very similar to the regular local workflow where you save a file, it evaluates your stuff, it's up to date. But instead of your local application being up to date, it's your production application that's up to date. And again, as I wouldn't recommend this for all situations, but as a solo developer, again, I found this to be very nice to use, and I would highly recommend anyone to just try it out just for the fun of doing it. And also kind of a fun fact is this workflow was actually a large part of the motivation for getting all this REPL stuff to be the way it is in the first place. Because I had started thinking about, what is the most convenient workflow I could possibly have, especially if you've got an application that you're only working on, maybe a couple hours on the weekend. You want to just get into it, make some changes, get them deployed. And I thought of this thing. And so this has had a fairly large effect on the way that Biff is structured. And so anyway, lots of fun. The last bit is server-side rendering. So again, I mentioned that Biff uses HTMX by default. And the reason I like HTMX a lot is, well, let me give some historical background first. So originally, in the very beginning, Biff used Clojure script in React by default, which is probably the most common way that people do web dev in Clojure. And that was fine, and I was experimenting with lots of fancy like back-end, front-end syncing stuff. But I hit this point where I realized, the applications I'm working on are really not that complex from a UI perspective. Like at least the stuff I was working on, they tended to have more like off-the-shelf machine learning stuff on the backend. So there was like a lot of interesting backend stuff, but the UI was not that complex, right? And so I realized, like, honestly, just server-side rendered multi-page apps is probably good enough for my application. So I added the new project script for Biff, I changed it so that when you started a new project, it would ask you, like, okay, do you want a multi-page app or do you want a single-page app with React and Clojure script? And so it was like that for a little while, but I really did not like doing that. Because again, like the whole point of Biff is trying to make those kinds of decisions for you, right? And so just right off the bat, we're asking this large decision, and a lot of people, like, maybe you don't know, and especially if you're not familiar with the ecosystem yet, and even if you are, like you don't know how your application is going to evolve, right? Maybe you think, okay, maybe it's good enough to start with multi-page, but then you realize, oh, it really needs to be a single page, and then you have to change it yourself and all this stuff. So the thing that I love about HTMX is that it takes the server-side rendered approach to development, and it just makes it more flexible. So again, it's not flexible enough to be a good fit for every single web app out there, but it greatly increases the number of applications that can be a good fit for server-side rendering. Enough so that I'm very comfortable with Biff just saying, this is the default, you get HTMX. And if you want something else, here's documentation, here is a step-by-step guide for, using Clojure script instead. But most people can likely just stick with HTMX. And especially too, for, all the documentation, having, a single approach reduces the documentation burden a lot, because then, we've got like tutorials and reference documentation and a few, well, at least one video. And so if we had these like two vastly different kinds of ways of setting up your application, we really would need to have, a bunch of duplicated documentation. And so I think there are a lot of benefits from just having sort of a one main approach that most people are on. And then also another little benefit too is with prod dev, like I was talking about, the nice thing about HTMX is there's no build step. And so with prod dev, you save a file, your stuff gets copied to the server, and there's no compilation step for HTMX, so your front end's already up to date. You can technically have this kind of workflow even if you were using ClojureScript, but the problem is that every time you save a file, it would need to compile the release build for your ClojureScript bundle, which is not particularly fast. And so like, instead of saving a file and your whole production app is up to date in 5 seconds, it's more like 30 seconds. And at that point, it's just not a quick enough feedback loop for this to be a good experience. So that is the design of Biff. I hope you liked it, and I'm open to answer any questions you may have.